Okay.
Yep, we're now live, Chair.
Brilliant. Thank you. She says now not able to bring up her script. I apologise. There's nothing but technical issues here. Okay, so members who are in the room, if you wouldn't mind having a look around at who the participants are, and if you can see any of your colleagues that are not in the room, there's every possibility they've done what I did and gone through their calendar for tonight's meeting and found themselves on Teams and not on Zoom, which is where we all are, as you know. I'm just bringing, so if you could sort of take a look at that and see if there's anyone missing. I'm just hopefully loading up my agenda so I can get my chair's announcements. Okay, so if everybody's ready. Apologies for absence. Is there anyone who has sent in apologies for tonight? Anyone who's not coming?
Councillor Gerald Morris has sent his apologies.
Okay. Late substitutions, la da 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 da. Do we have a substitution for Gerald?
None that I'm aware of, Chair.
Okay, that's fine. Can we take the minutes from the 19th of July agreed as read, unless anyone wants to make any comments on those? Does anyone have anything to comment on those? Is everyone happy with them? Okay, so I'll take those as a true record of the minutes of the meeting held on the 19th of July 2023. Chair's announcements. Members are reminded that any declarations of interest in respect of any business set out on the agenda should be declared as either, one second. Okay, these aren't what my usual ones are. Members are reminded that any declarations of interest in respect of any business set out in the agenda should be declared as either a disclosable pecuniary interest or declarable interest and are required to notify the chair of the nature of any interest declared at the commencement of the relevant item on the agenda. Members declaring a disclosable pecuniary interest must withdraw from the meeting for the duration of the item. Members declaring a declarable interest wishing to exercise a councillor speaking right must declare this at the same time as the interest, move to the public area before speaking to the item, and then must leave the room for the debate and vote. Notification of a business. I've had one. Any other business? Is there anything else that people would like to put to AOB? Can't see any hands. Okay. Wonderful. Information note, work programme for 2023-2024. So I will hand over to Georgina.
Yep, that one's me. Yeah, so this is just kind of highlighting the topics that we agreed at the last meeting for the remainder of this civic year. So last time we had water, this time sustainable development. The December meeting will be on waste, and then the March meeting will be on achievements. In terms of some of the projects that we've been involved with recently, we have worked to revise the biodiversity strategic action plan as part of the HECSP, and are now kind of developing metrics for the there's 5 kind of actions which we've decided to prioritise. So we're now kind of working on developing some metrics and monitoring systems for those priority actions. You may have seen that the second round of Solar Together is also open, and that will be open until the 27th of October. So last time it was open for a month for registrations of interest. This time it's open for 2 months, and people have still got another month to sign up. And we've done some comms to community groups and town and parish councils, and also tried to get the word out to businesses as well. We've also been working on drafting a climate related risks log, and that's part of the work of the Hertfordshire Climate Change and Sustainability Partnerships adaptation subgroup. So each council is kind of looking to identify climate related risks for their areas, and then we'll kind of bring them all together, hopefully as a draft in December. So we've kind of pulled together a draft, and then it's due to be sent out to kind of the service areas within North Herts so that they can kind of check it and agree that those are their risks, and then let us know any mitigative action that they currently take or that they plan to take around those risks. The Home Upgrade Grant 2 is due to launch. We've been saying this for a while now, but we had an email yesterday, so hopefully we should be able to kind of get our marketing plan going so that we can kind of get the word out to eligible households for them to apply for home upgrades as part of that scheme. We've still been plugging away at reviewing the Luton Airport expansion documents. So we've kind of been reviewing the relevant areas to ascertain whether the previous concerns that were raised as part of the process have been addressed, and then any which are remaining, which we feel like haven't been addressed, have been incorporated into the required documentation, so such as the principal areas of disagreement summary statement, and I'm sure we'll bring more updates on that in future meetings. I think we will be in attendance at the upcoming Royston Eco Festival, which I think is this weekend, actually. Heat decarbonisation plans. We are working to get heat decarbonisation plans created for our three leisure centres, which are our top energy using buildings and our top emitters from our estate. And when I say working to get those created, they're currently being created. And part of why we're kind of creating those is because the plans will show us how we can achieve net zero for those buildings. And we've been sort of missing out on pots of government funding and probably other pots of funding as well by not having those plans in place. And so by getting them in place, it means that there's kind of pots of funding that we can now apply to by having a sort of solid plan for you know, what technology could be put into those buildings so that we can decarbonise them. And so hopefully those plans should be ready in the next week or so, and then we can put in an application to the Public Sector Decarbonisation Scheme on the 10th of October. And then we're going to also look at how we can get heat decarb plans created for other buildings other than the three leisure centres. And the last thing I just wanted to mention was that the council have launched a community investment fund, and so that's open for community groups to apply for funding for capacity building activities. So capacity building could be, you know, doing a drive for volunteers or training your volunteers. It could be buying a piece of equipment to allow you to do something that you've not been able to do before, or going on some kind of training to help you learn how you can access more grants and that kind of thing. And ultimately, the capacity building should result in the community group being able to deliver something of benefit to the community. So we are interested in any kind of local environmental groups who might want to do a capacity building project so that they can deliver more environmental work within the community. So if you do know of any groups that might be interested in that fund, please do point them in the direction of North Herts Council's Community Investment Fund. And then just onto the action tracker. So we did amend the action tracker a bit to kind of reflect where the council could meaningfully have influence, and also some of the actions we felt, some of the actions, for example, around like bus smart cards. There was stuff going on, not in the district council, but at the county council. So we've kind of reflected the action plan, particularly the additional commentary column on the right, to reflect stuff that's been going on, not just in North Herts, but in county council as well. So we've got quite a few actions that are ongoing, a couple that are completed, and then 2 that are not yet started. And those 2 that are not yet started are actions that relate to waste and recycling, and they're actions that which we would like to be reviewed and picked up once the waste awareness officer is in post in 2024, and that post will be kind of helping to ease the transition into the new waste contract. So that's why those actions are kind of waiting for that person once they're in post. I think that's pretty much all I wanted to say, unless anybody has any questions.
Can't see any hands going up just yet. Brilliant, Georgina, as always. Thank you very much. I have a question about the environmental groups that can apply for the Community Investment Fund, do they need to be of a particular size, or how registered do they have to be? Just like a recognised organisation? Do they have to be a full-blown charity? Do they have to be of a particular size or have been running for X amount of time?
They have to be a not-for-profit. I don't think there's any kind of regulation about the size or how long they've been set up, but I think it does have to kind of comply with our usual grants policy. So they need to kind of show that they're, financially kind of stable, and they need to show that they've got a good governance structure. So it doesn't matter if they're new, as long as they've kind of got a governance structure in place. I think we have excluded any organisations that have received more than £10,000 from the council in the last couple of years. But I think those are the main exclusions. The main thing really is that they're not for profit, and that the activity they apply for has to be something that is enabling them to build their capacity, so that over the long term they can kind of do more stuff or improve what they're already doing.
So a structured group, ideally of a chair, a treasurer, a secretary, and maybe even a couple of trustees.
I think there is something on there about needing a safeguarding policy as well, which I think we require from all grants applicants.
Yeah. Liability insurance, that sort of thing.
That sort of thing, yeah.
Okay. I see John's hand has popped up. John?
Yes, please. Something I've been wondering about this scheme. Safeguarding policy, where there is no contact with vulnerable people, that would seem rather redundant, especially if it has to go so far as safeguarding checks, whatever the current acronym is.
I think if there is no contact with, say, children, for instance, I don't think you would need to have like DBS safeguarding checks in place. I think we do ask for a safeguarding policy regardless of whether the group kind of considers that they come into contact with vulnerable individuals or not, because I guess part of the policy is that it's looking out for signs, and you might not know whether someone is vulnerable to something like domestic abuse. But I know we have in the past had groups that apply to the community grants policy and they haven't had a safeguarding policy or a sufficient one in place, and then we've been able to kind of point them in the right direction to sort of find a template and show them how they can adapt that relatively swiftly so that they can be eligible to apply to the grant. So I don't think it should be too kind of arduous. I think it would be manageable if someone didn't have one to kind of get one in place relatively swiftly. And there's no kind of, it's rolling application. So there's no, the money needs to be allocated by the end of the financial year, but there's not a sort of very short window. So people do have a bit of time.
So to mimic somebody else, policy means policy in this case.
Yes.
It does not mean a whole lot of other baggage, even if unnecessary in the circumstances. And the only grey area I can see is where there is contact with children, except there is always a responsible adult responsible for them. The organisation does not take responsibility for the care of those children. I won't go into that because it applies, for instance, in forest schools.
Yeah.
It's an option as to whether that's the case. The danger is that it could be seen as the council recruiting free, not to say slave, labour, free voluntary labour, that's the word, in order to serve its purposes. And that therefore grants would only be awarded within the council's remit of operations. Can you show me that's not the case?
Do you mean if the community group involves children, or do you just mean if the community group involves any kind of volunteering?
Any kind of volunteering that serves the council's purposes, not just in line with the council's policies as such, but actually serving,
John,
in a nutshell, supplementing or displacing council staff.
No, that's not the. I don't think that's the intention of the investment fund at all. I think
I just wanted to check.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's just, and it doesn't have to be anything to do with volunteers. That was just an example of, for example, I'm just trying to give an example of capacity building to kind of show how it's distinct from, I don't know, like a parish council getting a new like roof or something. You know,
Sure.
it's supposed to be kind of capacity building. So it doesn't necessarily have to be anything to do with volunteers. But if an organisation kind of came to us and said, we want to run an event or a campaign to get more volunteers to do, I don't know, X, Y, Z, then that kind of falls under the remit of capacity building. But no, we're not looking to sort of, I think that isn't the criteria, that it's not supposed to be to replicate a service that is already offered.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that.
And generally, if anyone under the age of 18 is going to any kind of voluntary groups, like, for example, Friends of Norton Common or a litter picking group, they would be there with permission of their grown-up or with their grown-up. I know that we could, even when my son was 16, he was very fond of going to the Friends of Norton Common. He couldn't go alone. We still had to supervise him because he's under 18, and there needs to be that sort of legal element, and that's a safeguarding policy. No one under the age of 18 can come along alone, because at the end of the day, it's still dangerous work. It's, you know, it's tree felling stores, and, you know, the lovely and sadly departed John Baskerville was always so too happy to have my 9-year-old a sword, and she absolutely loved it. But I was there. Yes, I'm perfect.
Good mention, by the way, to reflect on John Baskerville. Thanks.
He was a wonderful human, and he will be sorely missed. John sadly passed away last week, and he was a wonderful, wonderful person. I'm going to steadfastly move us on to the next part of the agenda before I cheer up. So just bring us over, and sorry, thank you, Georgina and John. Was there any other questions or comments from anybody? John, I think that's a legacy hand you've still got up, if you wouldn't mind popping that down. Okay, so the Sustainability Supplementary Planning document, I'm just going to hand straight over to our relevant officers to take that on. Thank you.
I'll try to share my screen. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. I'm Omar Izzet. I'm part of the strategic planning team in North Herts. The Sustainability Supplementary Planning Document, or SPD, the presentation will be in three parts. So the first part will be a brief recap from the previous presentation, and then I'll explain the scope and include some excerpts from the document. Finally, I'll explain the next steps in the process and how the SPD links in with other policies and plans within the council and within Herts County Council. So,
Omar, I'm finding it a bit difficult to hear you. I'm not sure if you're a long way away from your microphone, and I don't know if it's only me, but it's a bit indistinct.
Sorry, I'll try to speak up.
Thanks.
Yeah. So the SPD provides detailed advice and guidance on the policies in our already adopted local plan, and it hooks on specifically one of the main policy regarding sustainable development in North Herts in the local plan. It does not form part of the development plan, and so for that reason it cannot introduce new policies. However, it is a material consideration in decision making, and basically our aim is to encourage developers to exceed the minimum standards in the building regulations. As we all know, sustainability is about meeting our current needs without compromising that of future generations to meet their own. Broadly, it is split into three main themes: natural resources, social and economic. Natural resources, sorry, in terms of the environment, social resources and economic resources. So the sustainability document, the SPD, considers all three themes. The scope of the document comprises passive design, energy efficiency, on-site low carbon and renewable energy, transport, waste, materials, green infrastructure, water efficiency, climate change in terms of adaptation and mitigation, and health and well-being, and culture and community infrastructure. It includes technical guidance on climate change mitigation in terms of reducing emissions, both embedded and operational carbon, air quality, and adaptation to climate change in terms of reducing flood risk, and including drainage strategies such as sustainable drainage SUDs, and conserving water resources and improving water quality. It covers wildlife and biodiversity net gain, green infrastructure, energy efficiency, both on-site low carbon energy in terms of solar, photovoltaic, etc., and also standalone renewable energy projects such as solar or wind energy and battery storage. It also considers sustainable location of development, where best to place development usually in places that are, for example, close to existing infrastructure, community infrastructure, health and transport infrastructure. And it also covers briefly sustainable transport and active travel and EV charging, minimizing waste and recycling, and circular economy and materials conservation and reuse, and water efficiency. It sets three broad standards or benchmarks. So the minimum requirements would be considered the policy compliant development, meeting the required building regulations. The highest standards that are more likely to meet North Heart's climate goals and declarations are gold, and anything in between would be considered as silver standard. This is the actual cover of the document. So the initial draft, we've completed the initial draft recently, and it's currently being reviewed internally and refined. I've included various excerpts from the document. So in this section, for example, we consider passive design in terms of layout and fabric and form to reduce mechanical cooling and heating. We consider, this section considers waste and how to minimize waste and to recycle, and consider the concept of the lifetimes of the individual components of a building and how it can be reused past the end of life of that specific building. We also consider things like embodied carbon. So there's a whole life carbon assessment for a template for considering whole life carbon assessment for buildings. And then we also cover wildlife conservation in terms of providing green roofs, water features, and providing wildflower meadows, for example, to support pollinators. And we also link into the Hertfordshire local nature recovery strategy. So this particular slide is considered biodiversity net gain. So obviously the minimum requirement is now mandatory 10%, which is going to be effective, we think, from November. And this particular example provides the checklist for considering biodiversity net gain. So the minimum requirement will be the I'll go back to previous. The minimum requirement will be considered as bronze, which is the 10% biodiversity net gain. Anything above that is going to be between 10 and 20 is considered to be silver, and above 20 will be considered as gold. And also projects that link in with the nature recovery strategy will be considered as gold. The SPD provides 5 appendices according to the different scale and type of development. So it's split into major and minor residential, major and minor non-residential, and domestic extensions and minor operations. This is for an excerpt from the example for major residential applications, for example, and it covers each section of the SPD with the different benchmarks required for the different levels. So in this case, we've got energy efficiency, low carbon energy and renewable energy, biodiversity net gain, and water efficiency. As explained, we recently produced the first draft, and it's currently being refined. So we're at some point here at the moment. We hope to go to Cabinet on the 14th, and then, subject to Cabinet approval, we'll go to consultation between the end of November and 10th of January. After that, we'll consider the representations and take the comments and inputs into account and revise the document as necessary. And then we hope to have adoption soon after the Cabinet meeting on the 19th of March. So obviously the document is not, it's currently in draft form, and it's not the final format. So there'll be an opportunity for inputs during the consultation stage, and we'll come back with an update, hopefully on the next environmental panel meeting in December. Yeah, I think that covers it. Thank you.
There we go. Are we back?
Yeah.
Hang on, there we go. Wonderful. Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you, Amar. I'm just going to quickly check who's got hands up, and then just go straight to the floor for questions. And first up is Michael. Councillor Muir.
Thank you for the SPD explanation. It will be very good once it's enforced. We have, for a couple of years now, had EV charging on all properties developed within North Herts for the last couple of years, which is excellent. But could we extend that to any new housing or offices where they've got a roof, say, south facing, that we, under planning, ask the developer under the 106 agreement to put solar panels on any south-facing roof?
We've actually covered that in the SPD. There is a mention of photovoltaic and solar covered parking structures in the SPD. Whether we can enforce it as a requirement, I think is not likely through the SPD, but it's something that could be perhaps considered during the upcoming local plan review, because the SPD cannot introduce any new requirements at this stage. But I think I think that's right. But Nigel can correct me if that's not the case.
Thanks, Omar. Yeah, that's correct. As Omar says, we can't introduce sort of wholly new policies, but obviously in terms of kind of that bronze, silver, gold approach that Omar's set out. So, for example, in terms of the SPD, sort of the bronze or the baseline is obviously comply with building regs, but then sort of under on-site low carbon and renewable, we're kind of saying if you meet, say, 25% of your renewables on site, that kind of gets you to the silver mark, and then 50% or above gets you to the gold mark. So there's opportunities for developers to kind of voluntarily or be strongly encouraged to make those sorts of provisions, and it will sort of count in their favour in the planning balance when we're considering their applications. Because under building regs and policy, we can only require them to go so far, but clearly if they sort of voluntarily step beyond that with our encouragement, then that's something that kind of weighs in favour. But in terms of a formal policy and an outright requirement, that would be for local plan review.
Thank you, Nigel. Okay, so I've got a couple of hands up now. So I've got Councillor Hinchliffe.
Actually, Nigel just answered my question, which was going to be about enforcement and status of this and whether it was just going to be voluntary. So I think that's all answered now, actually.
Wonderful.
If I could just sort of supplement quickly, just on Councillor Hinchliffe's point, because if a developer was to sort of, as I called it, voluntarily put something like solar panels on the roofs, obviously when we grant permission, there's a standard condition that then says you must implement that in accordance with your permitted plan. So kind of at that point, from an enforcement point of view, if they put it in their permission and obviously didn't provide it on site, then we have got an avenue to go back and sort of require that is installed as part of their development.
Mm-hmm. I suppose and with the levels of policy, if they can say, oh well, yeah, we install solar panels, and we can go, yeah, but only to a bronze standard, and sort of it gives that push to sort of like keep going up and and pushing for improvement rather than just it being a one thing or the other. I do like that. Right, I've got more hands. So I definitely know that Dear Linda was next.
Good evening, everybody. What I'd like to ask is about removing the need for supplying gas to new properties as part of this plan. Would it also be something that you could sort of encourage through your bronze, silver, gold aims, targets, whatever, that to discourage the supply of gas to all new properties, and so that they would use induction cooking? That would reduce the amount of indoor pollution in the house, and hopefully, well, not hopefully, it would definitely then provide a healthier environment for the development of children and for adults, and reduce their energy bills, so to make their properties more energy efficient. So is that something that we can look forward to, so that no new build will by default have gas supplied, but instead they would run on the transition for induction cooking, which is far more energy efficient and less polluting?
Certainly, the SPD does include a long section on providing energy efficient appliances within the home, and it does mention alternatives to gas, particularly for heating, in terms of using heat pumps, for example, and appropriate levels of insulation and ventilation. It probably can't go as far as to rule out gas supply completely, but I think that will come at some point through national legislation. But at the moment, certainly, the overall energy performance of a dwelling includes things like the energy performance of appliances, including domestic appliances and heating and cooling and ventilation.
Sorry, if I may just add that when you're heating a pot on a gas cooker, something like 70% of the heat just runs up the sides of the pot, and you're throwing away about 70% of the heat that you're buying.
Yes.
Well, if you're using induction hobs, they are a lot safer because people can't burn themselves on it. I mean, your pot still gets hot, and children also. There's a lower chance of children getting hurt within that sort of an appliance. But all the energy that you put into that pot, use in the induction hob, it all goes into your cooking pot. You don't waste heat. So it actually becomes cheaper to provide meals for the family, but it also means that you're not putting nitrogen dioxide into the home, because we now know that gas cooking has in the home makes sometimes the homes far more polluted than the air outside with petrol and diesel cars. So that way it would be a long-term benefit for the NHS and for the country and for the children growing up.
Certainly, yes, but I mean, the SPD includes, through the benchmarking system, it encourages developers to follow the higher standards. So in terms of using more energy efficient appliances, for example, induction hobs. So hopefully that will help to push people towards using these newer, more efficient appliances.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I've got a couple of hands up again. I know that Steve, was your hand going up an answer to something, or was that a question? It was a question. Okay, so I'm going to go to John then, because he was next.
Thanks, Chair. In the SPD, I think you mentioned including guidance of having solar panels on south-facing roofs, perhaps of business buildings, but funded under Section 106 agreement with the developer. Could that provide an unintended consequence of disincentivizing projects that would have included such solar paneling, but are now steered towards doing it via Section 106, when they would have done it anyway as part of their sustainable building standards? I'm not at all sure about that, but I hope it makes sense.
I don't think we mentioned that the panels will be installed through Section 106, but in the benchmarking standards, we included thresholds for the different percentages of renewable energy that you generate on site, both for residential and non-residential buildings, and for car parking, for example. But I don't think it goes into detail about developer contributions or Section 106 in that regard.
John, I think Councillor Muir mentioned Section 106 when he just made the suggestion about the solar panels, I think.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Understood.
And I think that was probably in the context, Councillor Muir, wasn't it, of, because Section 106 is on the one hand can be used to basically obtain money to fund things, but they can also be used to place a legal obligation on the developer to do something. And I think you meant it in the latter sense, didn't you, Councillor Muir, of putting a legal obligation for them to deliver the panels rather than taking money to fund schemes elsewhere, was my understanding.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so if that's answered, I can move over to Steve.
I may have missed it, but I'm not clear if we're saying anything about potential for such things as district heating. I mean, I understand that we're essentially, parts of this document are a wish list, things that we would like developers to do rather than things that we can compel them to do. But certainly in some of the larger developments, there are some significant opportunities for district heating with shared ground source heat pumps, that kind of thing. Have we done anything in there to encourage developers to do that?
Yes, I mean, the SPD does cover district heating, combined heat and power systems, and ground source heat pumps, biomass. They're all mentioned in the SPD. So whether the onus obviously will be to encourage developers to go for such systems, particularly on larger developments where the scale will make them viable to include. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. Next hand up was Roger. Roger? You're on mute, Roger.
Yeah, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear.
Yes, I'm really worried about this gas and no gas in these estates. Developers love gas. It's traditional technology. It's what they used to. It's what they are put in all these houses, unless we bust a gut to counter that. The government is slowly backtracking on a lot of its eco policies. And it worries me that unless we do something very specific and positive in the SPD, all these houses will have gas. They'll all have 15 kilowatt boilers, and will have lost the opportunity to do something about it. It could just be one line in the SPD, which could say, in the larger states, there shall be no gas supplied to these estates. It could be as simple as that. That forces the developers to take all these eco measures to get up to this gold standard seriously. Failure to do that, they'll sneak in all sorts of things to keep gas going. And that's my fear.
I think it's a similar point to the previous point raised. Basically, we're a bit limited in enforcing new policies on developers that are not in the currently adopted plan. But the SPD does mention, for example, the transition away from gas boilers, for example, for major schemes, and that we encourage developers to implement on-site alternatives and low carbon and renewable energy systems. And in the sustainability statement that they submit, they will have to outline these topics, and then we mark them according to the sustainability statement they submitted.
Just to bring in, I could be slightly wrong here, and I'm very happy to be corrected. But just recently at an environmental meeting that was discussing the sort of future-proofing when it comes to building homes and and domestic such when building requirements and regulations, it was pointed out by somebody there who was an expert in their field that you ideally need to keep the infrastructure and the connections for gas supplies to houses, because there could well be a switch over in the future from gas to something else, and having that in place in advance would future-proof that energy supply. Now, there's probably somebody in this room who's more knowledgeable about this than me. I'm quite happy to be corrected on it if I've been wrong, but would anyone like to come in on that? I can see lots of hands flying up all of a sudden. Steve?
I mean, the gas industry is very keen to push the notion that we should just replace current methane gas with hydrogen.
Yeah.
But there are all sorts of issues with that, not least the production of hydrogen that it introduces enormous inefficiency to use renewable electricity to create green hydrogen and then burn that in a boiler. It would be much more effective to use the renewable electricity with a heat pump and to limit the production of hydrogen to things that you need to use hydrogen for, of which there are some. There are also some real difficulties in terms of transmission of the stuff through pipes, since it escapes easily. So it's kind of an attractive idea if you make gas boilers and think that by changing them very slightly, you can go on making them. But in almost all cases, it's not the best solution. And it's certainly, in my view, is not the sort of thing that we should be trying to design into new developments. There may be some places where you have no alternative, but we shouldn't be designing anything in new locations.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Right, Chris Hinchliffe definitely had his hand up next.
Thanks, Amy. I'm a little bit pessimistic about the likelihood of how far developers are going to go with these things voluntarily. So I've got a follow-up question for Nigel, actually, is when we come to review the local plan, is there anything to stop us getting the gold standard that we have in the SPD written into the local plan wholesale and make it something that we require rather than a voluntary scheme for developers to choose?
Thanks, Councillor Hinchcliffe. Yeah, I think that's certainly an ambition we'd like to work towards. I think there's a couple of points in that. One, kind of the planning system's a bit up for grabs at the moment. There's a lot of government consultations about what it's going to be and what it's going to look like. And obviously until the levelling up and regeneration bill and everything that flows out of that comes out of it, I can't commit with certainty because under the current system there are, as Omar said, some restrictions on how far we're allowed to go over and above other kind of regulatory regimes. We're not supposed to duplicate, what other things that building regs do, but councils are increasingly pushing the envelope on that. And so, yeah, it's an option, but yes, I don't want to kind of prejudge decisions that you get to be made, but fully take the point.
Very much. Dear Linda.
So just very quickly to add to the information on the alternative to natural gas. If you use hydrogen, you still have an open flame. You still have potential for burn accidents. You still have the nitrogen in the room coming in contact with the ignition point, which is the flame, and generating nitrous dioxide, which is damaging to the lungs, to the brain, to your heart and vascular systems and all sorts of things. So it doesn't take away the health hazard. It just replaces one type of fuel with another. And yes, I agree with the information given that it makes no sense to waste hydrogen, which is generated from renewable energy, electricity generated from wind and solar, only to then burn it. You might as well use it straight away in induction. And the other thing is, if you think of a molecule, and I speak as a chemist, the molecule of methane is a carbon with 4 hydrogens. It's quite a comparatively large molecule. Hydrogen has just got 2 hydrogen atoms, so it's significantly smaller, and the potential, and therefore it leaks more easily through any cracks, or sometimes even through the fabric of the pipe. That the chances of things exploding and leaking and being a potential hazard, I would not trust myself. I wouldn't trust it in a lab to have hydrogen flames. I wouldn't trust it in my home to risk my own health, my own family, my own children when they were small. The risk of having hydrogen leaks and potential. I know they say they can put mitigations, but from the scientific understanding that I have, I wouldn't trust it. And I think we're going down the wrong route if we're pandering to people who say, oh, we might be able to put this down the pipes. You're wasting your time. We're not actually solving the problem.
Okay, thank you, dear Linda. Julia, your hand is up next.
I just wanted to ask a question whether the SPT goes into retrofitting as well. Things like what's the view going to be of the council of externally insulating and retrofitting houses? Does it cover that, or is that going to be covered in some other way in SPDs?
There is a section on retrofitting, yes, including retrofitting of historic buildings as well. Yeah. Okay,
and is it going to be positive, supportive of that?
It explains what can be done at the moment, and other instances where you have to apply to the council, to the planning department for an opinion. But there are ways and means of including retrofitting that are not that don't take away from for example, the historic character of a building or its settings. Yeah.
Okay, because it's quite confusing.
At the moment.
I must admit, I was trying to work out what's permitted development or not, and sort of just getting some clarity around that, I think would be very useful.
There's a section on that explaining it. Yeah.
Good, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that's all hands cleared and all questions done. Okay, so if that's that section done, we'll move on to the next part of the agenda, which I shall have in a second. So my MobGov has decided to go down. So talk amongst yourselves. It's fine.
Contemplate the infinite.
I know. So you're sitting there giggling at my 9-year-old is sat at this dining table right now giggling at me.
I think, Amy, I think it's the biodiversity net gain presentation.
It is, yeah. I just wanted to give it its full title. Thank you, Georgina. So next is the biodiversity net gain presentation. Thank you.
Hi all, thanks for having me, first of all. My name is Mark Wilcox. I am the Biodiversity Net Gain and Local Nature Recovery Strategy Project Manager at Hertfordshire County Council, which is quite a mouthful. So I wouldn't expect you to remember that, Councillor Allen. I could completely see why you'd be looking for your notes on that. I struggle to remember my title sometimes. So I've got a short presentation. I'm not a frequent user of Zoom. I typically use Teams, so hopefully this works fine. Let's see, it should be this one. Okay, has that come up in presentation mode for everyone?
I can see it. I'm assuming everybody else can as well.
Perfect, first time, great.
Wonderful.
So I wanted to talk to you about the Biodiversity Net Gain site matching service. I will talk a little bit about Biodiversity Net Gain more generally at the start, just to make sure everyone's on the same page and up to speed. Although from the previous presentation, I expect you probably all know quite a bit about this by now. So apologies if I'm teaching you how to suck eggs for this. By all means, someone jump in and say, yeah, we know all this, just get on with it. Right. Oh, sorry, let's make a bit. There we go. Right, so what is Biodiversity Net Gain? The short answer is that it is a mechanism of the planning system to deliver measurable improvements to local biodiversity. Effectively, it's a mechanism that ensures that wherever development takes place, any biodiversity that's lost through that development is compensated for and then enhanced. So that's the net gain part. A little bit more is added on top. I should also say apologies if you're really interested in this and I don't cover all the detail. I'm sorry, because there's a lot of information to get in, and I want to make sure I cover the site matching service and don't spend all of my time going down the avenues of this. So I'm happy to answer questions afterwards, and I'll provide you with an email if you have any further questions. So Biodiversity Net Gain, or BNG as it's typically called, will be rolled out in phases, and the first phase will be applicable to major developments. The way it's phrased at the moment is that major developments will need to deliver at least 10% net gain. So major developments, as you're probably aware, is 10 domestic units or more, or in this case, about 1,000 square meters if it's a non-domestic development. After major developments, BNG will start to be applied to other types of developments as well. I don't have the order and I don't know the limits of that. But major developments are the ones we're focusing on at the moment. They're the ones that we're most, I guess, concerned about, because that's the first phase, and that's happening very soon. So there will be some exemptions though. So it will not, as far as we're aware, apply to permitted development. It will not also apply to householder applications at any point, as far as we're aware. There was also discussion at some point about whether it would need to apply to brownfield sites, and current discussion suggests that it will still apply to brownfield sites. So you will need to deliver biodiversity net gain on brownfield sites. I should stress that this is sort of provisional. There's plenty that DEFRA are still yet to confirm. So we don't have a comprehensive list of exemptions yet, or a finalized list. So a key part here is also the at least. So you guys will have picked this up from the discussion over the SPD. The legal requirement is that 10% net gain is delivered on major developments, but this is a minimum. So as a local planning authority, when you are able to set planning policy, you will be able to suggest that more is required. So 20% biodiversity net gain is required. However, I should stress the 10% net gain as its legislation will not be able to be not provided by developers. There's no debate over the fact that 10% has to be required. If a local planning authority determines that they want to require 20% net gain, for instance, then a developer may raise questions of viability. So there's an obligation to provide a lot of evidence that this is appropriate. Right, so going into the how a little bit more. Biodiversity net gain needs to be secured for, again, this is a minimum of a 30-year period, although 30 years is pretty standard in most cases. And what we mean by this is that when you're delivering a development, what you're effectively doing is you've got your development site, you score your site using the biodiversity metric, and you get a unit number for that site, let's say 10 units. You build your development, and then you know that you've got to deliver 11 units overall. So sometimes that will be on site where that's possible, and sometimes you will be able to do that if there's a lot of green space left over, if you enhance the habitat, if it's quite low grade stuff and you improve it. An improvement in quality can constitute a 10% improvement in biodiversity net gain. It's not always an area improvement. But in many cases, you have to deliver it off-site. So a developer will have to find another piece of land to actually get that net gain, that additional 10%. And where they're doing that, where they're delivering it off-site, they will have to get legal protection in place, probably in the form of a Section 106, but it could also be in the form of a conservation covenant when they become available. We don't have the tools appropriate to be able to secure them at the moment, at least 9.5. And the site will have to be managed.
Has anyone else's Zoom completely frozen?
Mine's crashing too, Amy.
Yeah, I thought something gone wrong. Well, obviously something is going wrong. I think, have we lost Mark?
Mine's gone as well, Michael Muir.
Mine's still okay. I can't hear.
Some people not hear me.
I can hear you now.
Okay.
Yeah. We just lost you for a good 30 seconds or so. It seemed to crash absolutely everywhere, but I think we're back.
Oh, that's very odd. Okay.
So sorry. If you wouldn't mind just sort of...
Sure, yeah.
Just, I think probably just a handful of sentences would be more than enough.
Literally just summarising, saying that as a developer and as a landowner, you need to make sure that you are sort of eyes wide open going into the contract, as there's a lot of costs associated with the 30 years, and you need to make sure it's all tied up very neatly. Right, the when. This is a very poignant question today of all days. So if you've had your ears to the ground on national news, as I know Georgina has, you may have heard through a BBC News report that BNG, which was supposed to be rolling out phase 1 in November, has been delayed until next year. I don't have any inside scoop on this. The only report I can find of it is that BBC article. There are several other articles that have now been published, but they all reference that except one which doesn't provide a source. DEFRA have not said anything on this, nor of Natural England. So we are still working to a November launch date. And the small sites, which is effectively phase 2 of BNG, is supposed to be rolling out in April. And that will mean that BNG will apply to not just major developments, but basically everything over a household level that goes through the DM system. So still not permitted development and not nationally significant infrastructures projects, although that's expected to come a bit later. So probably worth very briefly going through this. I talked about on-site and off-site delivery. There is an expected hierarchy with this, in that you should try and prioritize delivering BNG on-site where possible. This is to try and make sure that biodiversity stays sort of in the local area. Moving a habitat miles away might mean that the habitat's effectively replaced, but the species dependent on that habitat don't migrate over there. In a lot of cases, you're not going to be able to do this. So off-site is expected in a lot of cases. And this flows into what I'll be talking about in a minute. Where you are delivering off-site, this should be as close as possible to the development site, where you can still practically deliver the same type of habitat. And where there's absolutely no on-site or off-site local option, there is a national credit system, which you may have heard about. It is priced uncompetitively, dare I say. I would say it's priced very, very uncompetitively. It's several orders of magnitude per biodiversity unit more if you're using credits, which is how it should be. It's to incentivize BNG being delivered locally. And in order to use the credit system as a developer, you will have to provide evidence that you've exhausted all local options and none are suitable. And you'll have to provide the evidence to yourselves as a local planning authority in North Herts. So this, I guess, really influenced the creation of the Biodiversity Net Gain site matching service, which is an attempt to ensure that we have a good local supply of biodiversity net gain sites within Hertfordshire. So this service that is currently being run by the Leeds team, which is a team in which I'm based, which houses our ecologists and archaeologists and landscape architects as well. Effectively, it works a bit like a dating site, if you like, for those interested in delivering BNG, so developers, and those with sites available for BNG, or what we might call receptor sites, so land managers, landowners. And it connects them up. So if you're a landowner or a land manager, it allows you to advertise that you have some land available. And if you're a developer, it allows you to basically put in your requirements to say, this is what I'm looking for. Importantly, it's not a marketplace. So this service does not in any way allow you to sell through the site or sign any contracts through the site. And we don't, no money changes hands through us. So the only payments that take place on this platform are purely by the purely a fee for advertising or a fee for making a request. It's also important to distinguish this from the National Site Register, which is a part of the mechanism through which you would register a BNG site when you've actually created the habitat. Part of your legal obligation as a landowner, if there's BNG on your land, to say this is basically official and it's linked to this development, and that will be part of the biodiversity net gain plan that the developer will have to provide to get their plan permission approved once BNG becomes mandatory. So National Site Register is a legal requirement, part of the planning process. The site matching service is a completely voluntary service, which we are offering, as I said, to try and ensure that there's local supply of BNG sites. So it works quite simply. It's not very tech heavy. You go to the website, which is part of the Hertfordshire County Council ecology page, and you can submit a site submission form as somebody who's got land to offer. Then an invoice will be raised, you'll pay that, and the details of your site will be uploaded to our service. Similarly, if you're looking for a site, you go to the website, you submit a site inquiry form, invoice is raised, you pay that, your details are then uploaded to our database, and then our service administrator will effectively match you with appropriate sites. And then you'll get sent a report detailing the top 3 matches. So we really wanted to be as flexible as possible in terms of the sites which we could be listed, which we would accept to be listed on the service, and in terms of requirements, what people are looking for. So if you're a landowner, you've got a vacant field and you know it's grass, basically, you know the size of it and you know where it is, you can list the site just with that information. And a few bits of personal contact details as well. However, if you are if you own a piece of land and you're set on delivering biodiversity net gain, you know that you want to go in that direction. You have a plan for how you want to manage that site over 30 years, let's say, and you have a specific habitat you want to create. You could go ahead, get an ecologist in, get it surveyed, create a management plan, and actually plant up the habitat, and then register it on that national site register I was talking about to get it actually sort of officially licensed as a BNG site with DEFRA. And then you can list it on the site matching service as well. In case you're wondering, that there's obviously a lot of upfront cost in that. The reason you might do that is because it would make it, we think, a lot more appealing to a developer to know that effectively that habitat has been established, and there's less risk upfront for them. We do say that you should provide as much information as possible as a landowner, because the more information you provide, the better quality matches you're going to get. You might get fewer matches, but the ones you get are much more likely to be from developers who have requirements that meet what you have. Similarly, we also suggest that you are as flexible as possible with your search criteria. That's on the developer side. So if you're coming in and you're looking for strictly pre-created habitat and you say you want 200 units, it's going to be more difficult to find you some available sites, because not everybody's going to invest in the land up front and pre-create habitat or have 200 units, for instance. So if you can be more flexible and say, well, I'll look at a site that's just been surveyed, for instance, or even if you're happy to go without a survey and think, well, I'll take a chance on this one and I'll get my own surveys done, we'll be able to provide you more options of what we have available. So it's probably worth saying a little bit about how we do the matching. I think a lot of people assume from when I've spoken to them before that this is done in a very clever AI algorithmic way. But we have a human doing this. We developed a process, but we have a human doing this, and that is specifically because we want them to be able to make ecological judgments, basically. There's not hard and fast rules on this. And we think that's the way it should be, at least for the moment. So we have 5 different types of criteria that we use to make matches, and they operate in a hierarchy as well. So we run through them in the order that they're listed here. So when we get a request in from a developer looking for a site, we would look at the type of habitat they're looking for, first of all. Now, as I said, that we're very flexible on the amount of information you can provide. So if they've provided a detailed specification of what they're looking for, so not just, for instance, grassland, but lowland meadow, for instance, then we will only match them with that specific type of habitat. If they've provided a broader habitat type like grassland or wetland, then we'll match them with the broader habitat type. We'll then look at the number of BNG units they're looking for. So again, this is something you can provide and or request, but you needn't. It's completely optional. If you say looking for 20 units, we we'll match you with sites that can best cater for that. If we can't cater for 20 units exactly, for instance, we say we've got 3 sites and one that could do 20 and 2 that could do 16, we still match you with all 3 because you may be interested in spreading your units across more than one site. There's no restrictions with doing that, and it may be that you just can't find one site that could host all your units, especially with bigger schemes. That's where a human element is quite useful. We then look at user requested criteria. So these are some of the additional things I talked about in the last slide. So if you want a site that's been surveyed or a management plan attached to it or pre-created habitat, we would look at matching you with a site that has those. If you haven't requested them, we can skip this, obviously. Then we get to the more complex legislation related ones. So strategic significance. This term is related to the local nature recovery strategy. We don't have one at the moment, as I'm sure you'll all be aware, and we won't have one for quite a while, probably about 2 years until we have a local nature recovery strategy. However, at the moment, strategic significance can be defined by local strategies and or plans. So we typically use the Hertfordshire Ecological Network Map to determine this. So we would prioritize sites for high strategic significance. And this is because if you're not aware, you get effectively a boost to your biodiversity net gain score if you deliver in an area of higher strategic significance. So you get more bang for your buck effectively. And lastly, we look at proximity. So going back to that hierarchy of on-site, off-site credits, the nearer the site is, the better. So we prioritize those sites that are nearest to the development. So just a couple of points left now. Costs. If you're not aware, this service has launched now. This presentation was ahead of launch, so you may be familiar with this stuff. We charge a flat fee of £110 plus VAT, and that's both to list a site and to submit a request for a site. And there's no additional fees or commission related to that. It is effectively at cost, mostly officer time. And that is because the purpose of this service is not to turn a profit, but to ensure that there's a steady supply of BNG sites locally, to ensure that biodiversity is retained within Hertfordshire and that development can continue, and this BNG doesn't present effectively a barrier to development, which is not the aim of it, obviously. So it works slightly differently in each case. If you're listing a site, then what you get for your £110 plus VAT is effectively 3 months of a listing. After that time, we'll send you an opt-in email. And if we don't get a reply, or you reply and say, I'm no longer interested, we'll remove the site. But if you say, I still haven't found somebody who's interested, we'll relist the site for free, and we'll do that indefinitely. So you only ever pay £110 plus VAT for however long the site's on the service, as long as you keep opting in. With a site request, if you submit something to us and we can't find anything, we'll first look at if we tweaked your search criteria. Could we provide you with something? And we'll get back to you and say effectively that. We can't find you anything, but if we made some changes, we're confident we could. At which point you can either say, no, thank you, and you'll get a refund, or we'll do it and we'll provide you with details. If we can't find anything at all, we'll just refund you. That does cost us effectively, because I said this is an at-cost service, but we don't want to take money and not provide a service for it. So the site matching service launched on the 19th of July for site submissions. It opened briefly after that for site requests, but it was then closed quite shortly to site requests, simply because we hadn't built up enough of a bank of sites on there. And so we couldn't carry out effective matching. Sites are starting to trickle out now, and we are planning to open on the 9th of October, or I should say we're planning. With today's news, if it is confirmed that biodiversity net gain sort of phase 1 rollout will be delayed to next year, I expect that would have a knock-on effect on landowners' interest in registering sites now. So we may need to relook at that. But the initial plan before today was 9th of October we would reopen. You can access the service on there. And I should say, any questions you have, we have a BNG specific email address, so do feel free to email that if it's about the site matching service or just generally about BNG. And I would say use that rather than mine if you have mine, because one of the team will answer it if I can't. So sorry, I didn't tell you what the address is. It's bng@hertfordshire.gov.uk. Okay, I'm sorry, I ran over a couple of minutes. Hopefully that was worth it to get the content in there. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mark. Just jotting down the website and bits. I sympathise pain over DEFRA not getting back to you. Similar things going on here with my portfolio. Just waiting and just left on red, really. So, okay. Right. Flurry your hands up. I didn't see the order they went up in, so I'm just going to go from the top left corner and across straight in. So first up is Steve Jarvis.
Not sure I was first, never mind. In terms of the providers of biodiversity net gain, I guess I don't quite understand the way this works, because my understanding is that there are people who've set up biodiversity net gain opportunities, and essentially they've delivered the gain, it's already there, and then they then sell it to people. Is that actually how this business works? So if they don't sell it to anyone, they could plough it up and plant corn or something like that.
Good question. At the moment, because it's not mandatory yet, they could effectively do what you just suggested there. They could say, well, we've got it and we can sell it, but if nobody's interested, we'll mow it down and do something else. Once it becomes mandatory, if you want to pre-create habitat in advance, I mean, you could still do that, but you would be strongly encouraged to register it on the National Site Register. And once you've done that, effectively, then you're locked into a legal agreement and you won't be able to make any changes to it. But the reason you would do that, because obviously there's a big burden, is that you need to protect the site for 30 years. And from what I understand, and I should stress this is what I understand, because again, DEFRA are a little bit vague around the detail of this. You can pre-create habitat, you can get the legal protection in place, you can register it on the National Site Register, and then the 30-year clock starts ticking, even if you haven't sold it.
Okay, right.
Then once you've got a developer interested, you can sell it to the developer. And for the sake of argument, because it gets a bit complicated otherwise, say you sell the whole site to a single developer.
Yeah.
Let's say you sold it to them 2 years after you register it with DEFRA. You'd only have to continue to manage it and have the legal protection in place for a further 28 years.
Okay.
Because the development still actually had 30 years biodiversity net gain, even if it predates the development, as long as it doesn't predate effectively BNG becoming mandatory.
Okay, so in 28 years time, if someone bought it, it would only be maintained for 2 years.
Yes.
Okay. So it's in that basis, you know, it's there's potential one-off gain now, but the real rate of gain, as opposed to the rate at which developers have paid for it, could be rather non-linear, couldn't it? People would create habitat, presumably with the intention of selling it, and then it might take them a long time, so they might not create any more.
Potentially. It probably is worth mentioning, though, that in order to do the pre-created habitat and then sell it afterwards to kind of deal, you could only do that for, well, you can't even register land yet officially because it's not mandatory. So that would, you know, the earliest you could do this is from whenever it becomes mandatory. So November, or if it gets delayed to early next year.
So in any habitat that's been created already doesn't count.
Yes, or they're going to need another 30 years from whenever they legally register it. So you could use habitat you've created now. So there's another cutoff. There's several stages of this. You have to have created the habitat before, I think it's January 1st, 2020. So if it's created before that, not interested. It has to be fresh habitat from that date.
Okay. Right.
But when it becomes mandatory, you're going to have to then register the site, and it will be 30 years from whenever you register it.
Okay. All right. Thanks very much.
One. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Steve. Next was Michael.
You two just.
Hello. I like the creating a cleaner and a greener, healthier Hertfordshire words. My question is, you like to see 10% biodiversity. Now, the county owns all the land north and east of Baldock, where Urban are the county's designer, and I believe that 10% B&G isn't enough on county-owned land around Baldock, because it was all greenbelt, taken out the greenbelt on our local plan. So we're going to have 3,300 houses north and east of Baldock. So I would, seeing the county owns the land, I would like to see at least 15 to 20% B&G, and is that possible?
Well, I think I've got good news for you, Councillor Muir. So as you'll be aware, we have the Sustainable Hertfordshire ambition to deliver 20% improvement, or sorry, enhancement of biodiversity on our own land by 2030. So slightly different to biodiversity net gain as this broader biodiversity. But in order to try and meet that ambition, although not an official policy, it is ambition that the county deliver 20% on their own developments and on their own land. Like I say, not a policy, so we haven't committed to that, but we do endeavour to deliver that wherever possible. Again, I can't speak about any specific developments because I don't know, but we do try.
Can I just say,
Yep.
You said by 2030, you could perhaps get that amount, but the building will start in the back end of 2025. So we need it in 2025.
Yes, so the ambition, the 2030 ambition is a wider biodiversity ambition. So now at the moment, we try to deliver 20% net gain on any development on our own land. But obviously, delivering 20% biodiversity net gain won't get you an overall 20% enhancement on your land, because we're not developing all the land we own. There's plenty of raw estate. So that's one mechanism which we will be pursuing, but there will be other things we will be doing on top of that to try and deliver 20% enhancement across the whole Hertfordshire County Council estate.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank
I'm
you.
just aware that we might be edging over into planning committee areas. I didn't want us to cross over into that too much. Next up was dear Linda.
I just wondered, when you've got something that has to last for 30 years, that's going to take from 2023 into 2053. Now, we're already on track to go well beyond the 1.5 global temperature rise, average across the globe, but that means that locally we could see average temperatures, climate temperatures rise more than that. And if you're going to have potentially fires or floods or whatever, how is somebody supposed to be able to ensure that it's actually any site is going to actually have biodiversity gains insured for 30 years? I can't see that being possible, not at this stage anymore. Because, I mean, look at what happened in Canada, look at what happened in Greece, look at what's happening all over this, the rest of Europe, or even in other parts of the world for that matter. How can we say that it could happen next year? All of those sites could be destroyed for us, but it could happen in 20 or 30 years time, you know, or whatever, any time in between. So how can it be ensured that somebody buys and then know that it will actually last?
It's a good question, not one I think I can answer in its entirety, but I can give you some assurance about what's being done to help try and ensure as much as possible the longevity of sites. That is firstly at the design stage for a BNG site. So any that come through to our ecology team, the ecologists will be looking to ensure that they are considering appropriate habitats that would be appropriate for future climate of Hertfordshire. So what's it going to be like in 30 years time, and is this habitat going to be appropriate there? I think the bigger point is probably that when a developer and a landowner are signing a contract, there's a lot in that I didn't talk about this evening around management fees. So as a developer, as a landowner, if you're accepting a payment from a developer to manage a site for 30 years, as well as it being on your land, you're going to want to consider how much you're going to be paying for fencing to keep people out, because plenty of habitats might not be suitable for public access. You know, they might be quite delicate. You might want to consider management costs, so whether you need animals to graze it, whether anything needs to be done. But you're also going to want to consider potential of what happens in extreme weather events. If a habitat's damaged, or if a habitat, despite best intentions with design, you know, the species planted just fail, it doesn't work. We have an incredibly hot summer and an incredibly cold winter like we did last year. That will all need to be factored into the contract. So a developer would need, well, a landowner, if they've done their research, will be asking for money to put aside to make sure that, you know, the habitat reparations can be made to the habitat, and it does continue to deliver the intended gains over the 30-year period. How exactly, if you're going to ask me how we calculate that, don't know. Very, very difficult. I think everybody wants guidance from DEFRA, and I'm not sure they can give answers on that either. It's incredibly difficult. Part of the reason we didn't want to get involved, I think, in the actually, you know, being involved as a middle person to negotiations, but rather just site match.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Just so I was aware, Nigel has had to drop out of the call, and he appreciates all the input on the SPD. Next up was John Webb.
Okay, thanks, Chair. On biodiversity net gain, once a site is licensed as such, is it then safeguarded? Who does the enforcement if there's an application for development on it? Will that be rejected? And if so, is it not a brilliant way for any landowner to block even a government infrastructural development? How does that work? This is at a risk of straying into planning issues, Chair.
That's a good question, Mark, if you're happy to take that.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to take it. I'm not sure I can answer it. And that's precisely because, as I mentioned, one way in which you would protect biodiversity net gain sites would be through Section 106, which are tried and tested, and we know how they work. We as local authorities know how they work. I'm not a planner. I don't know the details of how they work. But DEFRA are providing a new legal mechanism that will be useful to protect BNG sites, which is purpose-built conservation covenants. Now, conservation covenants bind a piece of land rather than a landowner. So even if the land is sold, the protection will remain on it for the extent of the covenant. And they could be set for different periods as well. They can be used for BNG, but also protecting historic landscapes, historic buildings, etc. However, to sign up to a conservation covenant, or sorry, to sign off a conservation covenant with a developer, you will need to be a responsible body. We don't have any responsible bodies yet because the application to become a responsible body has only just opened. And I don't have a good idea of how that's going to work in Hertfordshire. It's something I'm looking into at the moment. So we have single points of contact for biodiversity net gain in each district and borough, and I meet with them regularly. And it's, you know, a topic it's a problem we've discussed without a good solution. But it's something we're looking into to see if the county council will become a responsible body and will be effectively able to sign off conservation covenants within the county. So, yeah, there's two legal mechanisms there, but you asked about whether development was completely impermissible on a BNG site. And the answer from Natural England is no, not completely impermissible, but I don't have a clear idea of when it is and when it isn't. So they strongly encourage you, I guess, not to develop on a BNG site, but a conservation covenant can be undone. But we lack full knowledge of exactly how they work yet, so I can't really go into the details of that. I suspect with a nationally significant infrastructure project, well, that's exactly the kind of reason they would want a conservation covenant to be able to be undone, because there are reasons that trump BNG on a specific site, right? What they have been clear about is where that does happen, where a BNG site is developed, then the BNG that is supposed to be there at the end of a 30-year period is what you use as your baseline. And then that needs to be offset somewhere else. So you can't get away with saying, well, I'm building on this site, which has had a conservation covenant on for BNG a year ago, and it's actually still just pretty much, you know, a low biodiversity level field. No, you've got to assume that it's how it would be 30 years or 29 years in the future and take that biodiversity baseline when you then offset it.
Thanks, Mark. That makes a lot of sense. I've got a rider to that, again, only about licensed sites, a site once it's been licensed. Is economic usage allowed that is consistent with conserving that BNG status?
So what do you mean by economic usage? I think I know, but just to clarify.
Yes. If a landowner can think of a way of still making a livelihood off that field or hillside or whatever that's been licensed, without impairing its eventual biodiversity net gain as envisaged, are they allowed to do so? Or is there a presumption that, no, you mustn't do anything useful with it and certainly not make money out of it?
No, I think I'm conscious of saying that's absolutely fine. I've never heard this discussed, but what I have heard discussed is stacking, which is where effectively funding for other environmental schemes is used on the same piece of land. And there is no objection to that, as long as effectively you've got your money for BNG, you spend it on your BNG. And if you get any other money for that piece of land to do anything else, it's clearly something additional. And so if you wanted to plant up a wildflower meadow in your field, and that was part of a BNG scheme, but you also wanted a shepherd's hut in the corner and you were going to have an ecotourism business, yeah, fine. As long as it doesn't negatively impact the habitat, which it might. Public access could degrade some fragile habitats, but you know, as long as you could evidence that wasn't the case, yeah, fine.
Mark, by way of a thank you, I want to mention that, that for the first time I saw an otter in this area. It was known, it is at Paxton Pits, broadly this area, not even Hertfordshire, but that was quite a thrill. In daytime, fishing. So there, in the first quarry in Paxton Pits. Thank you, Chair.
Wow.
Steve, I think we may have lost our chair.
The chair.
Hello?
That's not a possibility, doesn't it? John, had you finished?
Yes, yes, thank
Yeah.
you.
Right. I think the next hand up is Chris then.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, and thank Mark. That was very interesting. I thought John's question was very interesting as well. You can see how sort of something like Net Castle Estate could well be, producing low impact meat, for example, and make the claim that that's advantageous for biodiversity, but they're still able to produce something and sell off of that. I also enjoy the idea of endlessly compounding biodiversity net gain, then gets built upon and required to have the biodiversity net gain somewhere. But the question I wanted to ask was just about our role as a local planning authority. So sorry again for a slightly planning orientated question. Is there anything, the biodiversity, when you talk about it, is quite an abstract concept, but what it really means is nature that brings people well-being. And for those of us who represent, towns, but with immediate rural hinterland, that countryside that is potentially very, very valuable for in terms of improving people's lives. So if you're talking about biodiversity net gain potentially off-site, that the people have, local residents have maybe lost their access to a piece of nature, but the benefit that the biodiversity net gain policy is bringing is potentially somewhere completely different. So as a local planning authority, do we have any ability to require the biodiversity net gain to take place either on site or within a specific distance? Or is it just out of our hands?
That's a good question, and one that I'm trying to get a good answer to. So when the ecologists get a planning application in which has a biodiversity net gain element, they will get a copy of the natural income metric, which is the tool that's used to determine the biodiversity unit score of a site. And in that, there are various different factors that contribute to that score. One of which I mentioned in my presentation, strategic significance. And the other one, and strategic significance has the advantage that if you deliver a BNG site in an area of strategic significance, you get basically a multiplier. So for the sake of a metric, it says you're delivering a little bit more than you actually are. To incentivize delivery in specific areas. But there's also something called the spatial risk multiplier, which is intended to ensure that where biodiversity net gain has to be delivered off-site, it's delivered nearby the development site for specifically the reasons you mentioned, benefits to humans so that people don't lose access to green space, but also benefits for nature as well. Because if you have a species that's dependent on a habitat here and you move it 50 miles away, maybe all those butterflies and invertebrates aren't going to be able to relocate there, and we might lose them. The spatial risk multiplier sort of works in the other way, which is the further away you get from a development site, the more your biodiversity score gets degraded. So it goes down by minus 25% and minus 50%. The problem with that is that it isn't just purely on distance. It's based on local planning authority boundaries and national character areas. It's quite complicated, and I probably already said too much, but there are issues in that in some cases, it seems like if you were delivering a BNG site in, if you had a development site in, say, St. Albans, because of the way this works, you might get a better score if you actually deliver somewhere in Essex because it's in the same national character area than, say, in North Herts, because that's a separate national character area and a separate LPA, even though obviously we want to keep it in the county. So the response from DEFRA when we had a long detailed discussion about this was, it may be that you can use local mechanisms and local levers to encourage BNG to be delivered within your LPA. But I don't know what they are. I don't really know what they were hinting at. The best that we could work out from conversations is that perhaps you could have an SPD that recommended that opportunities within the LPA boundary should be exhausted before other opportunities are sought. What was very clear was that you can't interfere with the metric. If the metric says, well, you know, it's minus 25% if you deliver it over here, then it's minus 25% if you deliver it over there. As a local planning authority, you can't overrule it. So you can only put more rules in place on top of those rules. That's not a good answer, and I wish I had a better one, because it's really puzzling to me why it's set up like that. And I'll be working with the BNG single points of contact across Hertfordshire and DEFRA to try and get a better solution to this, because we do want BNG to be delivered locally for exactly the reasons you said, right? It's much better when it's delivered nearby, and we definitely don't want it to be the case that a developer thinks, well, maybe I should just deliver this in Essex because actually I get much more, because it saves me a lot of money, basically. And it's not going to be cheap to do in the first place. You can completely understand why a developer would see that argument.
Thank you, Mark. Sorry, everyone, I dropped out for a couple of minutes because my phone ran out of battery. Wasn't charging like I thought it was. Are there any other questions? The chat box is cleared for me, unfortunately, so I can't see anything else that's been popped in there if there was anything new.
Nothing more.
You can see. Hang on a minute. Dylan, do your hand? Oh yeah, it is up now on the participants. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
I'm just wondering, you suggested that St. Albans developer might be able to, or advised to find it cheaper to get his increased in biodiversity in Essex. But then what happens if Essex wants to use that bit of land in Essex for their own credit gain? I mean, are we going to have county wars or something? I mean, you're going to have like a dispute resolution of, you know, whose priority is going to be using this bit of land because my developer or your developer wants to use the same piece of land to justify his development or his destruction. Would that happen?
I'm not sure about county wars. I am in regular contact with the local nature recovery strategy lead in Essex. So it's something that we're thinking about, how we can manage this issue. I would say that the same issue works the other way. So somebody who's in Essex might be very interested in delivering in St. Albans, albeit not at the same time, presumably, otherwise they would just use their, use the nearby sites. I don't think it's something we're going to be able to get involved in. The view of DEFRA is that really it's up to the market to provide opportunities for BNG. And the best thing I think we can do is make sure that we've got a good offer of local sites, which is exactly why we have the site matching service. And so we can encourage local landowners to provide opportunities for BNG within the county, and also as local authorities look at our own assets to see if we can also deliver BNG on our own land and make that available effectively on the market to developers. Other than that, I don't think there's a lot we can do to get involved with it.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Any other questions from the floor? Can't see anything. Okay. Right. Bear with me. Right, thank you very much, Mark. I appreciate that. Lots to think about there. Very interesting subject. I definitely saw the, oh, hang on. What was that? Okay, never mind. I definitely saw the cogs and wheels turning in John Webb's head earlier when he was asking that question, and I shall say no more. Right. In that case, I think that's probably coming to the end of our environmental panel, unless Georgina, there's anything else to bring in at the end of this point. Then we have some any other business, don't we?
I think we also had Roger had a thing he wanted to say, didn't he? I think in public participation.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I'm just going by my notes here, and I didn't jot that down. Okay, so Roger, if you want to go first before we jump to any other business with John, does that make sense?
Yes, sorry, I was just popped out for a cup of coffee. I've caught up with you. Do you want me to say what I've got to say now?
Yes, please.
Oh, great. Georgina, have you got a picture of the house slide you could put up, or if it's too difficult, don't bother.
I can grab it. Hold on.
And it makes a bit more sense to have a picture while I'm gabbing on. Thank you for this opportunity to put my 8 pence in on all this. I'm really worried about the fact that I believe most of these developers will bust a gut to not do their best to combat climate change. But while they're trying to do that, I'll make a start. It'll only take a few minutes. Good evening. First of all, I would like to introduce you to 2 new words or expressions. These are Carolean and mathematical bricks. If you just show the first picture, if that's possible, Georgina, you don't need all the words. Yes, Carolean and mathematical bricks. I'll come to mathematical bricks later, but Carolean is the era of King Charles. Just like the Georgian era Georgian is the era of King George, as in most of the older houses in Baldock, and Victorian is an era of Queen Victoria, as in most of the older houses in Hitchin. The homes you will be authorising in the local plan and in your SPD will be built in the Carolean era. Carolean is spelled Carolean, and it's actually Latin for Charles. I'm sure King Charles, if King Charles III was consulted, that's our present king, of course, he would expect the highest eco standard to be applied to all these new developments. You have the opportunity to do this in your SPD, and it would be very courageous, and I suspect set a precedent for local authorities if you did so, bearing in mind, of course, that you have declared a climate emergency. So you need to do some exceptional things to make sure that all these new houses are to a high standard. Now, LETI, the London Energy Transformation Initiative, has established a comprehensive set of alternative building standards that far exceed the present building regulations. This standard could be specified in your SPD for all the larger new estates in the local plan. The LETI standard is in use mainly in one-off builds, but is also relevant to whole estates. I'm not personally aware of any council authority specifying the standard, but there has to be a first, and why shouldn't North Arts Council be that first? These homes, as I outlined at your previous meeting and as shown in the diagram, have no gas. They're typically 40 centimeters of all-round insulation, a triple glazing, no bricks, mechanical heat recovery system, and these sort of properties only need 3 kilowatts of heating. You can pull that out of a 13-amp socket. You don't need gas or anything significant. If you build to LETI standards, you only need 3 kilowatts of heating. Before COVID, LETI accepted that homes built to the standard cost a bit more, £8,000 to £14,000 more. But this has to be not only offset against the reduction in whole life running costs for such homes, which is typically 100 years, but may well have reduced. Brick walls have probably risen in price more than wooden frame structures. And also these homes lend themselves to having a pop-up factory where all the wooden frames can be fabricated on site, providing considerable saving. Such a pop-up factory could be moved from one estate to another, speeding up the building process and avoiding, and it's been in the press recently, avoiding the chronic shortage of bricklayers. One final point, I keep getting asked, what is the alternative to facing bricks? The British home buyer seems locked into bricks, but which are no longer an eco option. Cladding for wooden frames can be brick slips. These are 1/2-inch thick bricks bonded to a backing board, or mathematical bricks. These are tiles invented 200 years ago, are mounted vertically, and which look like whole bricks. I am told that all the brick-faced Georgian houses in Baldock High Street are in fact clad in mathematical bricks. So there's another word for you, mathematical bricks. In summary, please be brave and courageous. Recognise the need to go down the eco road and specify the LETI building standards for all the new estates in the local plan. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Roger. Hang on a second, just bringing up. Okay, does anyone have any questions for Roger on that presentation? I'm not seeing anything come up. Okay, Steve.
Not really a question. Not really a question, but an observation. I mean, I think that Roger has set out some things that it would be great to do. I mean, the answer to the question of what you do in replace of facing bricks is to have no facing bricks. We don't need to have brick-clad timber framed houses. The issue, and I think we covered some of this when we were talking about the SPD earlier, the issue is what we are allowed to do. And my understanding is that we will be allowed to insist on more when there is a new local plan. But what we can insist on in general is severely constrained by the government. And it's, yes, we will be brave, but doing things we're not allowed to do is not brave. It's probably foolish would be the best way to describe it. So regrettably, it appears the government is heading in the wrong direction on many of these things, but they need to give us the capability, and indeed every other council in the country, the capability to do those sort of things. So we stop increasing the number of inadequately insulated houses. I don't know if Omar wants to say anything about the planning rules surrounding this, but I think I understand the position, and I think the answer is we should be able to do it and do it as much as we can, but we're not allowed to do everything we want to.
Yes, I mean, I agree with that totally. There's a limit as to how much we can divert from the currently adopted local plan, but the SPD does mention passive house standard and LETI as a gold standard, something to aspire to. Developers can aspire to, if you like. So we've mentioned both standards as as a top benchmark to aim for. But I think, as Councillor Jarvis said, there's a limit to what we can introduce in the SPD at the moment.
Okay, thank you. 1 second. Okay, any more questions or comments? Can't see anyone's. It's quite tricky to see on the phone. There we go. Okay, right, I'm just aware of time. Going to go to John Webb's any other business that he wants to bring up regarding Herts County Council.
Mm.
Okay,
Yes,
go ahead.
please.
John. Yeah.
Right. I just want to draw to the attention of this panel for future discussion. Please don't launch into it now. The fact that Herts County Council has, a week ago today, launched a strategy for electric vehicle charging points. Now, doubtless this leaves loads of issues unanswered, but in my view, at least it's in the right direction. And it says the following. I'll just read out a key paragraph. I've included this in the chat box with a link so you can follow it up, and we can prepare to have a discussion of this in its own right, if and when, it's more a matter of when appropriate. The strategy sets out a plan to provide more charging points so residents and businesses will be able to recharge their electric vehicles conveniently and appropriately in the future. It's forecast that by 2030, a minimum of 3,000 public charge points will be needed in the county, a 6-fold increase on current levels. Around half of these are anticipated to be provided in locations such as workplaces, supermarkets, and forecourts, with public authorities providing the rest. That's all I want to say to put this in context for the time being. My impression, and I've done a bit of surveying of this, is that provision is very uneven across North Hertfordshire, let alone what it might be across all of Hertfordshire. Some places seem to have nests of electric vehicle chargers, maybe a bit lopsided in terms of which kind they are, what power they are, and what age they are. That can be crucial. But in other places, you can turn up and there really aren't any in use. So that's really all I wanted to say for the moment, in view of a future discussion, I hope. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, John, thank you. Regarding the ad hoc layout when it comes to charging points, I would imagine there's, much like how Letchworth is basically a patchwork quilt of who owns and who's responsible for which bit of land and how and such.
Exactly.
It's also factored in that it's actually really quite hard to suddenly try and crowbar in like a whole new infrastructure to something that's been designed and set up for something completely different. And then how it's managed, paid for, who pays for it and when, etc. Steve's hand's gone up. He's probably far more aware of all this sort of thing than I am, really. Steve, you want to jump in?
The only place in Hertfordshire that has any significant volume of on-street charging, EV charging, is Watford, which has found a way to do it in advance of the county council. In terms of off-street off-street charging, there are, I think it's 26 more off-street charging points in car parks about to be installed in North Herts across each of the towns. I mean, the big hold-up has been in terms of the on-street, where the county council has spent quite a long time getting to the point where anything can happen. And I think we're still not quite there, but I hope there will be some progress on that. Although in some places there are some significant issues about power supply as well. So I agree, absolutely, we haven't gone fast enough, and I hope that we'll be able to make some progress now the county council's decided that it is in favour of some on-street charging, having for several years said they thought it was completely unnecessary.
Yep. Thank
you. Okay, thank you. Just to add, by the way, that as far as I understand it, regarding power supply to charge cars, if there was enough in place for everybody to have a car that they charged and then we all charge it, the grid couldn't cope. So there is a case of, it's not just a case of sticking chargers in, it is a case of actually having enough power to it. I understand there's some issues with a new housing development on the way to Royston, near Fairfield, I think, where there's some major issues regarding the on-street charging there, which they didn't anticipate. But it is not just a case of bunging in as many street charging points as we can. It's a case of what can be supported. Okay, anyway, we're not going to go into it. We're not going to go into it because we've come to the end of the cabinet panel on the environment tonight, and we're not discussing that. We're going to be discussing it. We've discussed other things, and the next meeting is due on the 6th of December 2023. We'll be discussing my favourite topic of waste, because I can talk about bins for hours, but I'll probably only do a little bit. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming this evening. Your input has been fantastic. There's been some brilliant presentations, been some great questions. As always, it's been a really thoughtful and considered evening, and I really appreciate everybody's attendance. And thank you to the officers who work so hard to bring this all together, and our attendees who come along and make it a worthwhile evening. And thank you, everybody, and good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.